called Future. The Future is Here. And it has a series of maps, and this one shows how some of the ecosystems will change and shift in the coming decades. And I only want to highlight one part of this map, and that's along the coast. We have a more stable situation. So we are already seeing massive change in other parts of the province, including more fire, more insect outbreaks, a different landscape will emerge. That simply means that we have to work harder to protect more of those forests that are more resilient because of the proximity to the ocean. The temperature increase is a bit reduced. The situation is a bit more stable, and that's where we have the best chance to keep more trees alive and standing for future generations, make sure that we have at least parts of the province with clean water, clean air, and more carbon stored in forests. It's very urgent, and we're not seeing the response from the government. Here is another reference to a report from Rachel Holt, Gregory team, and this is a distinction for BC in this context to distinguish between management for resilience, management for resistance, and for transition. That means that hardest hit parts of the province need more help to transition to a new landscape. In some cases, it means that different tree species will show up or need a little bit of help because the landscape is changing so rapidly. But along the coast, we need to manage for resilience, and that means to protect more and destroy less, reduce the damage in the landscape. Nature a better fighting chance to adapt to the changing climate. We have a lot of science now showing that old growth forests continue to function as a carbon sink and not dead forests, like some people in the industry try to tell the public. They continue to grow and absorb more carbon. This is an example of the annual uptake of carbon. It's different in the boreal, in the temperate, and the tropical, and these are the number of tons per year. So in the case of the temperate forest, they absorb about 2 tons of carbon in addition to all the carbon that is already stored every year. This is for old growth. So they are getting slower in taking on more carbon. They're like money in the bank. They have a lot of carbon stored, and they sequester more over time, and we have to make sure that it remains stored in resilient ecosystems. This is a beautiful example of a spruce on the Olympic Peninsula, the Queets spruce, and my attention because book author included information how this tree is so healthy. It continues to sequester the similar amount of carbon every single year, like a tenth of a hectare of young second growth forests. And it's no surprise, it's big, it has a lot of needles to do photosynthesis, a huge surface. It's a carbon absorbing machine that nature has created, and we have no machine that human invented machine that can beat a tree like this one. Here's a reminder about the situation along the coast. So we're looking at the Great Bay Rainforest now, the north and central coast, and the southern portion of the coast. And the simple finding here is that there is way more intact old growth left in the northern half compared to the southern half, with a lot of yellow areas for young forests. And in the Great Bay Rainforest, we can still find large intact rainforests, like in this photo. And that's because we got to a solution in 2016 that has resulted in setting aside the majority of the forest. They're still logging at about 15% of the area. But it's a conservation agreement that includes science-based conservation. So a similar amount of all the different types of old growth is set aside. Stringent logging regulation with more protection for riparian areas, for wildlife habitat, for cultural values. A new government-to-government relationship where First Nations have increasingly more decision-making power, whether it's about protected areas management or logging lands. They have greater power, and they are advancing and taking more decision-making power back, which is really important for the government relationship and a new chapter in the sad story of colonialism. $120 million of conservation financing package that was brought together by the federal government, the provincial government, and one half from foundations, and money is being used to support indigenous communities, economic alternatives to destructive logging, protected areas management, and similar sustainable activities. A really important role, and has allowed to reduce unemployment and build First Nations capacity in resource management and other important capacity. The remaining area where forestry continues allows for long-term certainty. There's now, although a lot of work remains, there's now certainty where logging can happen and where it should not happen. In contrast, on the southern part of the coast, this is what the original old growth looked like, with dark green areas for tree ecosystems and lighter green for low productivity old growth forests in higher elevation and outer coast. And today we have a massive loss of old forest. We have about 20% old growth left overall on Vancouver Island, less than 10% looking at the productive old growth forest where the biggest trees can be found. And as you know, or probably heard, we are still losing about 10,000 hectares every year on Vancouver Island alone. And we are looking closely at Vancouver Island because it has unique ecological values. Another reason is we have quite a bit of information for the island, but not for the whole province. And there are other parts in the province that have very unique ecological old growth values too that need more protection. Here's a shocking aerial photo from the southern island, and the pace with which the old growth loss continues on Vancouver Island is actually 3 times faster compared to the loss in tropical countries, amazingly. So there's 25-year grant information from the FAO, from the United Nations, showing that tropical countries have lost about 10% of the remaining intact tropical rainforest in this 25-year period, 1990 to 2015. And when we took a closer look on Vancouver Island and attempting to compare this, we found that we have lost another 30% of what remained in 1990 in just 25 years. So again, we are really failing in terms of global responsibility and leadership protecting intact forests. And here's a reminder why the second growth that is coming back is not delivering on does not provide the same value in terms of habitat, carbon storage, the same value for recreation and tourism. It is a greatly diminished ecosystem. It takes centuries for old growth to come back. BC government is not allowing young forests to go back because they're issuing new cut permits for very young stands that in some cases they are 80 years old, in some cases they are only 60 or 50 years old, and they're not even close to recovering the old growth features that would allow some of the web of life to come back into this forest. Another report from 2013, Carbon at Risk, showing just how many millions of tons of carbon dioxide we are causing on Vancouver Island alone by logging old growth. So in short, it's time for change. We are crossing all these red lines for the climate, for the web of life. The land use plans, LUP stands for land use plans, are outdated in large parts of the province. Vancouver Island land use plan is more than 20 years old. Outdated science, not considering First Nations legal rights that are increasingly strengthened by courts, not considering climate science. We have increasingly high ecological risk for old growth ecosystems. That means the percentage is shrinking every day. And business as usual is now increasingly damaging. It's more damaging to cut down the last percentage points of old growth for the species, but also for communities that are looking to a diverse economy. It's more damaging for forestry jobs because they're getting closer to the end of old growth. They're still not preparing for a transition and supporting industry to create jobs that don't depend on old growth depletion. We have a changing BC economy where overall service industries and other activities are providing more jobs compared to resource extraction. First Nations rights are increasingly strengthened. There are new conservation options like indigenous protected areas. Federal government has provided more than $1 billion to support an increase in the protected areas network across Canada, with particularly emphasis on First Nations protected areas. And we're not seeing the BC government supporting that. There's growing support for protecting the last old growth across the province, many different walks of life. And we know from the Great Rainforest and other places what the steps are. The ingredients are international and local pressure and government leadership. We need moratoria. In some cases, we call them solution space. We need an agreement, and if the talks between all involved need more time, then we need to pause logging to allow the time for the analysis, for the discussions to find solutions and understand the alternatives to logging before it's too late. We have to use science, and we have to combine the conservation steps with support for indigenous nations that want to protect more forests, and for companies and businesses that are seeking alternatives to logging the last old growth. All of this will require funding, but this funding will result in many benefits for economic diversity, for climate, for protecting ecosystems and the web of life, and many long-term benefits in terms of clean air, clean water, and other life-supporting systems. We were hoping to see some of this work happening pretty quickly because the NDP included in their platform in 2017 that in partnership with First Nations and communities, we will modernize land use planning to effectively and sustainably manage BC's ecosystems, rivers, lakes, watersheds, forests, and old growth. And they would take an evidence-based scientific approach and use the ecosystem-based management of the Great Rainforest as a model. Now, they've kept the first part of this paragraph in the mandate letter for the forest minister. They've dropped the last part. We haven't heard about using science and the ecosystem-based management approach in other parts of the province since they took power. And we are increasingly stressed out because the BC government is talking quite a bit about post-revitalization with industry. And they are talking about making some changes in forestry regulation to improve public trust. So quite a few things related to forest management and forestry jobs, but we've not heard a specific commitment on protection of the most endangered old growth. Just a few days ago, Minister Donaldson talked in the legislature about how still drilling down to understand what people want. That is a big concern because we have been very clear in the last 20 months that what the solutions are and what our recommendations are. A quick story of hope. This is a photo from January 2017 in the Clackamas Sound region where the Hausert Nation announced their land use vision. That's one of the nations in BC that is seeking to protect more of their land, and they live in a spectacular part of the world with a lot of intact rainforest valleys. And this is a map showing the land use vision outcome from the Hausert Nation. They want to set aside the majority of their territory as indigenous protected areas. And so we're still waiting again for this and other areas for a coherent plan and political leadership to support First Nations that want to protect more land in BC. There are opportunities with the federal government. We have not seen the leadership from the BC government. So a few quick examples about some of the things we are doing. In last June, more than 200 scientists working with Sierra Club BC sent a letter to the BC government saying, it was a great promise you made to follow through, protect last endangered old growth across this province, coastal and inland. Then we have here a number of the hotspots across Vancouver Island that are very important, and similar hotspots exist in other parts of the province where we need solution space. We need a pause in logging consistent with what scientists call for to allow an increase in protected areas. That's one part of the solutions that we are calling for, and the scientists support. And another one is to share detailed information, not superficial information, showing where are the red zones, where is the remaining old growth falling below percentages that are so low that the species that depend on them cannot survive. That's where we need immediate action to stop old growth logging first, and then the government needs a plan how to quickly phase out old growth logging for ecosystems that are at moderate risk, at low risk, to stabilize this ecological decline. Many of you joined Sierra Club BC calling for action on this website, rainforestisland.ca, and know that what we are calling for is a set of steps for conservation, to strengthen First Nations governance and community well-being, and supporting industry to transition to second growth forestry. In October, we also shared more than 180,000 names from people around the world working with a German group called Rainforest Rescue, and we delivered their names too. And in February 6th, I think, we shared 20,000 names from British Columbians with the BC government in front of many MLA offices. And just before I get closer to the end here, I want to mention one specific development. So the government has just tabled some changes to the forestry regulation, FERPA, Forest Range and Practices Act. They are limited. This is supposed to be the first step, and some of the changes are related to sharing more information with British Columbians so they can actually understand what logging companies are planning and weigh in earlier. But we really need far-reaching changes, and apparently there will be more amendments, more changes coming in 2020. This will be very likely the most important opportunity in the coming weeks and months to let the BC government know that those changes that they are preparing now must be significant and must include old growth protection. We will keep you up to date on the opportunities to comment, but this will be likely be very significant in coming weeks and months. And a reminder that we have spectacular intact old growth, including on Vancouver Island, remaining. This is part of the unprotected wall ban, and there's a great urgency to have temporary solutions followed by lasting solutions, and we will need your help. Galen will talk more about some of the opportunities to take action, and we will have opportunities for this discussion now. I think I have one last one, because I talked a bit about climate and that was a little bit dramatic. I'm really impressed with this quote from Tim Flannery from a book called Now or Never, where he explained that the amount of carbon uptake globally of all the forests and plants combined is equivalent to about 8% of all the carbon in our atmosphere. So every year, plants absorb a similar amount to 8% of all the carbon in the atmosphere. And then, of course, they also breathe out. They also release carbon dioxide. If we can restore ecosystems, if we can protect more forests and keep the carbon that we already have in forests stored in these ecosystems, we can significantly reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere. Not only reducing emissions from burning fossil fuels, but actually reduce the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And many of those 120 billion tons of carbon that we lost over thousands of years could be returned into forests and our vegetation, and it will be part of the solution. It's time to pause and allow questions and discussion. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jens. A lot to think about there. And there's already been a lot of discussion happening over in the chat box for those of you who are over there. A few questions have come up so far, and I'll read you the first one, Jens. It was, what portion of old growth is on Crown land versus private land in BC?
So overall, about 90% of BC's lands are public lands and about 10% private lands. On Vancouver Island, it's significantly different. On Vancouver Island, roughly a third is private land and 2/3 are public land.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to throw it over to Henry for the next question.
Thanks, Jens. Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. We had another question. Someone wanted a point of clarification, and the question was, did they hear right that there was 100,000 hectares taken on Vancouver Island over the last 13 years?
Yes. So, and the current pace of logging is on Vancouver Island is about 10,000 hectares per year. And then there's a little bit more second growth logging, not that much more. And what this means is that if you go back and look at the last 10 years, you get quickly to a ballpark of 100,000. We had a little bit of a slowdown in the 2007, 2008, because of market conditions, the companies logged less. There were a few years when it was lower, and we have a very detailed map that some of you might be interested in. If you Google Sierra Club BC White Rhino map, you will find our so-called White Rhino map, and it shows old growth logging for 2006 to 2016. You can see where the old growth was logged, and during those years it added up to 88,000 hectares, and we had about 10,000 in 2017, likely 2018. So that means at least 100,000 hectares in the last 12 years.
Wow. Okay. Another question here that just came in is, can you explain how the carbon credit system that benefits private forest companies on Vancouver Island works? Is it an effective way to protect forests?
So, carbon credits or carbon offsets can be part of the solution or part of the problem. One important observation I have is that climate action must be primarily in form of regulation and quickly reducing emissions from fossil fuel emissions. Then a small part of the solution can be related to carbon credits. And there must be no mistake, it cannot play the main role or an important role. It's a small contribution. Otherwise, it cannot work. And in terms of forest management, that means that most of the carbon benefits must be accomplished through regulation and more protected areas. And then some of these carbon benefits can be accomplished through market mechanisms. And there are carbon projects on private lands and on public land. For example, in the Great Bear Rainforest, we support the carbon project the First Nations are involved with, because it helped to increase protection to a very high bar. First Nations are controlling and benefiting from this project. And it's about carbon in old growth. It means that there's an immediate benefit for the climate. It's not planting trees. Tree planting is really dubious in terms of carbon credits, because it's important to plant trees, no doubt about that, but we cannot have certainty that the trees will be healthy in 10 or 20 years with climate change, and that means there should be not a carbon credit mechanism. In terms of specific projects on Vancouver Island, on private lands, every single carbon credit project must be assessed on a case-by-case basis. It's really important to make sure that all the standards are met. It must be credible, it must respect Indigenous rights, and must be transparency around who has done the work, is it with certainty for the future, and many similar questions. So it's important to take a closer look at each project.
Thanks, Jens. So the next question we had was related to the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement. And someone wanted to know whether this agreement is being respected currently, both by corporations, and someone else was interested in whether it's being respected by government too.
So there are serious delays, unfortunately, in terms of implementing some of the promised steps in 2016. So we are seeing a little bit of a repeat like in previous years, and main mechanism that we need in place now, 3 years after the 2016 agreements were announced, is reserve lines. So about half of the forest set aside in that region is in protected areas, with certainty that nobody, no company and nobody else will log trees in protected areas. The other half it's a result of the logging regulation that requires a certain percentage of every type of forest to be set aside. And there's work to be done that will result in reserves. So there will be lines on the map that show what old growth and wildlife habitat, cultural values will be off limits to logging. And some of this work is underway but not finalized. However, logging continues in some of these areas, and it's an increasing concern because the promise was that the most important areas would have their reserves done within about 2 years, and that would have been 2018. So now we really need again a lot of work for the environmental groups, but also probably in the future for our supporters to remind government and companies that they have to make this a priority, or they must pause logging.
Thanks, Jens. There's a question that just came in at the bottom of the chat there. It's an interesting one. Can you explain what the differences are between privately managed tenures and BC forestry tenures? Specifically, what policies do they have to adhere to? Continuing the question, I've heard that privately managed forests are far worse. Do they not have to follow the same policies? And if so, is this a key policy the government should target?
Yes, unfortunately, there's a big difference. In fact, both regulation for public lands and the regulation for private lands is weak. But for private lands, it's even weaker, as based on the common perspective that ownership should give you a lot of freedom. Governments have a history of allowing a lot of freedom, flexibility in terms of how much logging can happen on private lands, and it's a huge concern on Vancouver Island because the private lands have been overlogged even more than public lands, and many of these private lands on Vancouver Island are in the southeastern part, and with growing communities, growing number of people live close to these private lands, and they have to invest more, for example, for clean water, because the forests are so damaged that they have increasingly difficulty to get clean water. So the regulation for public lands, so the Forest Range and FERPA, Forest Range and Practices Act, is more significant in a way because more lands will be regulated through this act. 90% across the province, 2/3 on Vancouver Island. So in a way, it is very important for concerned citizens to focus on that and make that a priority. But we actually need even more improvements for private lands regulation and make that more stringent too.
Thanks, Jens. Henry, if I can butt in with another question here. There's one from Nicola, I think follows nicely. She asks, can you identify what role forest district managers can currently play in the solution? She says, our community will be meeting with ours in the Kootenay region soon. Thank you.
So the shared concern from many concerned citizens and forest experts across the province is that district managers have greatly reduced power in decision making in the last several years, and was a really significant erosion in terms of the ability of local decision making within government as a result of bringing in this weak forestry regulation in 2003, again called FERPA, Forest Range and Practices Act. It has very unfortunate language. This law mentions repeatedly that some of the things that companies are supposed supposed to do to protect the environment must not unduly impact timber supply. So essentially, it's language saying that timber supply trumps everything. It's almost like you can try to do you should do a few things for the environment, but you keep in mind that timber supply is the most important thing. And if it's too difficult, you can probably not do it. And this perspective, this ideology has resulted in local staff and district managers in essentially almost no case standing up to companies and saying this is something you cannot do because the language keeping timber supply above all else resulted in a lack of leadership locally and province-wide. So the first set of amendments, the first set of changes supposed to help change that and bring back some of the decision-making power to district managers. But I'm not holding my breath. I want to see that in reality, and I believe that we need much stronger language in regulation and a lot of education and political will from our government to see this happen.
Thanks, Jens. We're pretty much out of time for question and answer, but Henry, if you have one more quick one, we could do it.
Sure. There's a question here from someone. They were wanting a point of clarification. They said they heard some people state that younger forests take in more CO2, and your presentation implies that those who say that's the case are not taking into account current storage and effects of logging. So could you clarify this, Jens?
Yes, very important question. So the short answer is that very small trees, very young trees, do not sequester a lot of carbon per year. They need several decades before they begin to sequester a significant amount of carbon. So 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, that's where things are getting interesting. Latest science shows that trees absorb most of the carbon of their lifetime in the second half of their lifetime, and about 70%. So what this means is that cutting down trees when they're 50, 60, or 80 years is the worst we could possibly do in terms of significant carbon sequestration. Here in BC, we are cutting down almost all the trees at an age where they're just getting to the most interesting part of their life in terms of the ability to sequester more carbon. And only when they get very old will the annual uptake be reduced. But again, since we have so much carbon accumulated in an old growth forest, it's really important to avoid short-term loss that we see after a clear cut, and some experts call it sequestration dead zone, because for over 10 years, a clear cut will release more carbon than the young, tiny trees can absorb. Only after 10, 11 years, we have the beginning of a little more carbon uptake.
Awesome. Thank you, Jens. Thanks so much. You provided us a ton to think about, and obviously we could discuss it a lot more. And so we'll be back next week with another speaker. So in the meantime, I want to invite everyone to join us on the Sierra Club BC Volunteers Facebook group. You're welcome to engage in discussion there. I know there's more questions here that didn't get answered. So you can go there and ask them or make comments there, and we can connect to each other. The link I will post, actually, Henry, if you could post a link in the chat box. I've also put it in the email that I sent, and I'll send it again. So each week I'm going to suggest an action that we all can take. This being the first of 8 weeks, it's going to be really simple. I simply am asking folks to post a photo of yourself in the forest or in any forest on the Facebook group and tell us where it is. So if you don't have a photo, you've got to go out into the forest and take one. It's important. The first step in protecting the forest is just to get out into them and understand them, and also to connect with each other. So this will help us do that. If you're not on Facebook, you're welcome to send your photo to me and let me know if you want me to post it. or share it around. In the next email I sent, I'm going to include a few readings from Jens to further what he talked about today. And I know he'll check out the Facebook group to see other questions that come up there. I want to thank you all for being a part of this first webinar. If your question wasn't answered, again, please post it on that group. Next week, we have a really special guest. We're going to be joined by a man named Eli Enns. Eli is a New Chalmouth Canadian political scientist who is focused on constitutional law, international dispute resolution, and ecological governance. He's also organizing an event next week in Victoria to celebrate the 35th anniversary of the creation of the Mears Island Tribal Park. So that event is Wednesday, April 17th. It's at 6 o'clock at 90 Dock Street in Victoria. It's not free. You've got to go and get tickets. And so I included the information in my last email, and I'll send it in the next one as well. If you're in Victoria, I really hope you can be at that event. But either way, you're going to get to hear about it on next week's webinar. I also want to let you know that we have a podcast called Mission Transition. Season 1 is out. Season 2 is coming in the next few weeks. It's about clean energy and beyond. And I'll talk more about it and give the release date when it comes up in future webinars. If you enjoyed this webinar series, we invite you to become a sustaining member and help us do more of this kind of thing. To make a monthly donation to Sierra Club BC, if you donate $25 a month or more, you'll get a Sierra Club BC t-shirt that's nicer than the one I have on. And thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be part of this webinar series. The next one is next Thursday at noon, and my email will be arriving for you in the next few days. Thanks, Henry, and thanks again, Jens.
Thanks
everyone. Thank you.